Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for another online beekeeping field day. My name is Madlen Kratz, and I work for the Department of Primary Industries as the Honeybee Industry Development Officer, and I'm based here at Tokyo College. Today, I thought I would take the opportunity to discuss our ever-changing management practices and specifically how that relates to honeybee nutrition. Then in reality, we're constantly surrounded by changing conditions. And over the last few years, I think it would be fair enough to say that we've certainly been experiencing a lot of different events, from droughts to bushfire to floods, weather extremes, and so on. And that has had a big impact on our industry and individuals. So while we have been going through those events, there's still a need, or it can become quite challenging to still meet the needs of honeybees in terms of their nutritional requirements so that they can get access to the nutrition that they need. And the same applies to also meeting pollination needs and having strong enough bees, or in first place the resources to be able to build strong bees to then have the outcome or the pollination services that we would like to provide. I'll also quickly mention our current exotic pest incursion, and at the end of the talk I'll just make a few comments about how honeybee nutrition also plays a role in managing varroa. So what happens when honeybees do not get the nutrition that they need? And in ways very similar to us, honeybees become more susceptible to disease. It also makes them more vulnerable to pesticides. And when honeybees don't get the nutrition, those nutrients that they require, it also affects their longevity. And we know that it also has an impact on their immunity. So overall, we can say that poor nutrition really has a strong impact on honeybee health and on individuals, but also at the whole colony. So I just quickly want to remind ourselves about the nutritional requirements that honeybees have, and we'll start with nectar. So nectar is really the source of carbohydrates or sugars for honeybees. And nectar also has other, besides sugar, it also has other trace elements such as minerals and vitamins, but it really is a source of energy for honeybees and essential for things such as flight, heat production. They also require large amounts of carbohydrate for wax production, and honeybees, I think as most of us know, can store nectar as honey in large amounts. But the important thing to note, and I really want you to remember this as we go through this talk, is nectar has a stimulating effect on brood production, and we'll come back to that in a little while. So what about pollen? And pollen really provides all other nutrients for honeybees. So that includes proteins, fats, sterols, vitamins, and minerals. And I think the important thing to note here is that different pollen types provide different concentrations of those nutrients. So for example, with protein, which can be broken down into its individual amino acids, can vary in the amount of protein that the pollen is providing to honeybees. So it can be, for example, as low as 7%, such as in some of our wind-pollinated species, but also up to 35% and even higher than that. Honeybees honeybees that have access to a protein source that's about 25% protein is a good source of protein, but the higher the better. And coming back to amino acids, honeybees actually have, that we know of, 10 essential amino acids, and they have to obtain those essential amino acids from the diet, so they cannot produce them by themselves. And we know that if honeybees, for example, do not get access to those or have enough of those amino acids, essential amino acids, then that can, for example, impact on their longevity. But honeybees also have requirements for fats, as I mentioned, so they need specific essential fatty acids as well, and specific concentrations of sterols, vitamins, and also minerals. And protein is so crucial for brood production, the longevity, and also the immunity. Pollen, as such, gets stored in much smaller quantities as bee bread inside of the hive, usually around a kilo or so. And the other thing I want to mention here is that, or emphasize again, is that not all pollen types have the same nutritional profile or produce the same quantity of pollen. So, for example, if you might have bees on a honeyflower or nectar flower of a specific tree species, it doesn't necessarily mean that while that specific species produces a good amount of nectar, that it is also optimal for pollen. So it might still not produce the necessary concentrations of a specific nutrient. And generally speaking, in Australia, a lot of our eucalypt species, for example, are low in isoleucine, but also it might not provide large quantities of that pollen. So how do we manage honeybee nutrition? And I think the first option that comes to most people's minds is to move honeybees to a better location. However, while that is the preferred option, it may not always be possible, either because there's limitations with access or because we simply don't have other sites where we can place bees, or they could be a long way away and it might logistically not be possible. So what are our alternative options, specifically when we're also talking about other conditions, such as if we are facing periods of shortage? And that is supplementary feeding. So with supplementary feeding, I think the interesting thing is that it currently, it has been practiced in Australia, it is practiced internationally, but specifically in Australia, it is something that has always been mostly looked at as a last tool that we would use, and quite often it can be used a little bit too late, or it is simply not a standard practice in Australia. And however, there's more and more of a need to be able to fill those shortages and to build bees up to certain strength for when we need it. So the question always becomes, why are we feeding and what are we trying to achieve? And as I already mentioned, there's different things that we can do, and one is to feed bees, to be able to maintain bees through period of shortage of either nectar or pollen, and that can be in a scenario of drought, bushfires, floods. It can also be just during a period of shortage or different species not flowering in the same year. If you're trying to build bees, and one scenario would be to build bees for pollination or for honey crop, to be able to get the maximum output or to maintain the health of the bees through a crop pollination period, then we can also use different tools to stimulate bees by providing them with sugar syrup, sugar, and pollen or pollen supplement. And the other scenario could also be that there might be, again, a shortage on a honey flow where we want to provide this extra pollen or extra support to bees to be able to have the strongest bees coming out of that event. As I said, it is not a supplementary feeding is not a standard practice in Australia, and I think because of that, there's still lots of questions that we are asking specifically under our Australian conditions. And this is where this current project, it's a 4-year project, a supplementary feeding project that I'm currently leading, came about because we wanted to answer some of those questions about how much should we be feeding to be able to achieve a certain outcome, how often, at what frequency, how often in a week or every 2 weeks, and with specifically sugar syrup, what concentrations. Like we do know that a thinner sugar syrup, for example, has a more stimulating effect, similar to nectar, than higher concentrations. But the key question here is what are actually the effects on production in the end? How much brood is the colony producing? How strong is that colony? How big is that colony? And very importantly, what are our costs that we are putting into managing the nutrition of our bees, whether it is simply the cost of the feed, whether it is extra labor, and what are the benefits on production and on individuals' businesses that we are achieving in the end. So these are the sorts of questions that we would like to get some answers for, some insights into. And this project is funded between AgriFutures and the Department of Primary Industries. There is a whole team behind this project, and that includes Melinda Brown, our honeybee technical officer, also Richard Hayes, who is providing more of a supportive role, Doug Somerville, he's part of the advisory committee, same as Rob Manning and Steve Fuller. And then we also have Michael Clark, who is assisting with the cost-benefit analysis of the project. In relation to supplementary feeding and having to adapt and adjust to changing circumstances, I would like to share with you a situation of what happened this year during almond pollination in Victoria. And Melinda and myself got a chance to meet up with the broker, Trevor Monson, that has been organizing hives in the Robin Vale area. And usually about 120,000 hives are what Trevor organizes and his team organize every year to go into pollination for almonds in the Robin Vale area, which is truly remarkable about how all of that plays out. But this year they had about a 50% shortfall of hives for pollination. And the reason being is that once we had a standstill on hives in New South Wales because of the Varroa incursion, there was no way that beekeepers from New South Wales were able to bring hives into Victoria for almond pollination, which happens every year. So this year, Trevor and his team had to become a little bit more creative and adjust to those changing circumstances, which I'm sure has put a lot of pressure on them, but also on the growers for not exactly knowing how many hives are they going to get and what is the impact on the crop. Because we need to keep in mind that commercially grown almonds are in fact 100% reliant or close to 100% reliant on honeybee pollination. Almonds produce good quantities and quality of pollen, but they are actually short in nectar. So the idea was to use sugar syrup to stimulate the bees for pollen collection. Because once they're being fed with sugar, it stimulates them to actually collect more pollen, and that then also stimulates brood production. So around the orchards in the Robin Vale area, there's still some other shrubs flowering here and there where bees can get a little bit of nectar from, but not enough to actually meet their needs. And generally speaking, beekeepers have to bring in the hives with honey stores. So what you can see in this image here is the trailer that and the beekeepers were towing through the orchard and were putting out tubs or those little shells that you can buy from Bunnings for kids, and they were filling those shells with sugar syrup, and they placed straw on top so that the bees had a landing platform, because otherwise the bees can drown in the syrup, which you can see in the IBC here. And those shells were placed at each drop every few hundred meters throughout the orchard. So they were using about a 30% sugar syrup concentration, which is also what some nectar types would have. It was equivalent to 750 mils per hive that they were providing in terms of quantity, and the bees were mostly open fed in that setting 1 week prior to the peak flowering of the main almond variety, and also 1 week after. As you can see in this image, also the weather wasn't the best, but luckily it didn't actually rain during the feeding period. But it was still quite cold in the mornings, and it had to warm up to a certain temperature, which is usually about 11 degrees, where the bees actually then start flying. But within a few hours, the bees were actually consuming the syrup. So what we actually wanted to know in the end, or what the beekeepers and the growers want to know in the end, is what is the impact on crop yield, and what is the impact on hive productivity and health? What are the benefits? So the impact on crop yield is actually something that we don't quite know yet, because as I learned during this trip, is that almonds have 2 natural drops of nuts before you actually know the final yield per tree or per orchard. So the second drop is probably getting close to the second drop about at the end of October. So while we don't know the exact yield for this year just yet, I think there's certain things that we can certainly say about this whole feeding exercise. And that is that first, as I mentioned, the bees consumed the sugar within hours, within at least 4 to 5 hours. It was also really good to hear from a grower that we spoke to, who noticed, and he said, "Oh, the bees actually they have vigor, like they are stimulated." And we also saw the bees collecting almond pollen, which is distinctive by its color, and that's just a photo of showing some bees collecting almond pollen at the entrance of the hive. But the other positive thing that I think is coming out of this exercise is that definitely beekeepers can also see a difference in the way that their hives are potentially coming out of the orchard. So if the bees have that extra stimulation of being fed sugar syrup, not only are they then collecting more pollen, but they also have more brood, and they're coming out stronger at the end of that pollination period. So while there is a potential benefit on crop pollination, and the growers are quite hopeful that there will be a benefit even if the hive numbers are reduced, because there is also potential that the trees in that instance might be losing or dropping fewer nuts. But and I think this is always a scenario where in fact we can't relate the feeding exercise as the only factor towards the end result of the yield, because there's always multiple factors in the environment, whether it's the weather that could have an impact because the weather wasn't optimal, rainfall, and so on. But at least we can say that for time being there's certainly been positive observations that we've made, and that we clearly saw during that period of when the bees were being fed. And of course the beekeepers saw also the result when the hives came out of the orchard. So I think this is just where I want to remind ourselves again, why are we feeding? What do we want to achieve? And feeding during pollination in ways is not a new concept. It is being practiced. And another example is New Zealand, where they've been feeding sugar syrup for now several years to encourage bees to collect more pollen during kiwi fruit pollination. So it can be supplementary feeding can be very useful in that scenario. But not every crop is the same. Not every crop provides the same amount of pollen or nectar, and in some instances it could be beneficial to actually feed before or after, depending on what the circumstances are. Or for building bees, for maintaining bees. So I think the one thing we always need to be clear on is, why are we feeding and what are we trying to achieve? And hopefully very soon, or within the next few years, I should say, we will be able to answer a few more questions about how are we actually going, can we go about this in terms of the quantities or the frequencies at which we might be feeding. And as I promised, just quickly want to touch on how honeybee nutrition fits into the whole Varroa story. And I think the interesting thing is that, again, it shows that nutrition is such a crucial component of our overall health. So whether it is for humans or whether it's the same for honeybees in this case, because we know that once that mite gets into the brood cells and it affects the newly developing bees, we know that those adults that have been parasitized, they show suppressed immunity. We also know that the bees become more increasingly susceptible to various pathogens, and it has an effect on their longevity. But here I also want to mention research where people have looked into hives that have been infested with Varroa, so there were similar infestation rates, but they've specifically fed some hives with pollen and others weren't fed. And so while they didn't necessarily notice, or the pollen didn't reduce virus levels as such, so that was fairly consistent, it improved the tolerance and the resilience of bees to viral infections. And I think this is again shows the importance of nutrition there. So in the end, honeybee nutrition is so crucial for having healthy and strong colonies, and it improves longevity, immunity, and is just such a crucial component of health. So with that, I want to leave you with a last quoted sentence, and this is coming out of Fat Bee Skinny Bees, a manual on honeybee nutrition for beekeepers, written by Doug Somerville, which I think very nicely fits into the story of adapting our management practices and our ever-changing management practices to the circumstances as they arise. And I'll just read that statement out to you. It says, the only way to stay in business in the long run is to adapt and change management practices as the circumstances dictate. With that, I would like to say thanks for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the field day. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to contact me on my email address, which is up there on the screen. Thanks again, and bye for now.